allow you to pick a lot of it up. You're just blind to it. So you see at one level of resolution, and that's the human level. You see things of approximately our size. You see things that are approximately the size that we can grip. Those are sort of the things that you're likely to think of as objects. Like clearly a mountain isn't exactly an object, you know, so usability is part of what defines perceptibility. And so that also screens things out. And so then you're left with, well, what it is that you have to deal with once everything's been screened out. And then you might ask, well, there's still a lot of complexity left there. Like there's plenty of complexity within the average family. And there's plenty of complexity in the mating domain, you know, to find a partner and to establish a reasonable long-term relationship and to have children and to raise them. There's plenty of complexity left. And then the question is, how did biology come to solve those problems, given that they're almost infinite in complexity? How can you do it? And the answer to that is fundamentally a Darwinian answer. You start simple, so that's back in the days of the one-celled organisms. We have no idea how those things got their start, right? I mean, the actual beginning of life is a serious mystery. And I'll tell you, it's such a serious mystery, this is completely unbelievable, but one of the people who discovered DNA, I think it was Francis Crick, in fact I'm virtually certain it was, he actually believed that DNA came from an alien civilization. He wrote a whole book about that. It's called panspermia, and so he posited that it's possible for DNA to drift through space for millions of years and to land on planets and to start living, and that God only knows how old DNA is, because he just couldn't figure out at all how it could have possibly evolved. So scientists are a lot weirder than you think when you start to read, you know, about what the scientists who discover things really thought. They're completely, you know, out of their mind. But whatever, we'll assume that DNA got there somehow, and then evolution took over after that. And so what does evolution do? It basically says, well, here's a terribly complex problem that we've sort of partially solved. And partially solved means we've lived long enough to produce another copy of ourselves. That constitutes the solution. That's it. So we've lived long enough so that we can conceivably duplicate ourselves. How should we do that? Well, a variety of different ways. That's the answer. We should produce variants. So that might be multiple offspring, or it might also be facilitated by random mutation. Hypothetically, the mutations are random. Although there's increasing evidence, by the way, that organisms are much more complex at the genetic level than anyone ever assumed. And bacteria, for example, swap DNA back and forth with other bacteria all the time. And there are experiences that you can have that will change your genetic structure sufficiently so that you will transmit that to your children. So, you know, the idea that everything's purely Darwinian and it's only mutation that drives randomness, that's clearly likely, but not complete. These other mechanisms are clearly there. But the issue is that what you do is you start with something that kind of works, and then you produce microvariants of it, and then the world around you changes a little bit, and hopefully one of those microvariants manages to do the same thing, and then it produces a bunch of microvariants, and then they manage to do the same thing. And so what's happening is there's an arms race between the environment, which is always changing, and the organisms that are trying to keep up with it, and that arms race just goes on forever, and, you know, different life forms proliferate as that occurs. It's sort of like life is always playing catch up, and you never get it right. You cannot get it right. The best you can do is get it right long enough to live long enough to reproduce. That constitutes the sum total of your knowledge. So what that means, at least in part, is that you guys are all the beneficiary, let's say, of a evolutionary process that's basically been going on since the beginning of life, and that's about 3.5 billion years ago. And so your body, your psychophysiology, has been in an arms race with the transforming environment for 3.5 billion years trying to keep up, and poof, you're the stellar consequence of 3.5 billion years of, like, effort and death. So, you know, you might thank the cosmos about that. You think about this, hey, every single one of your female ancestors successfully reproduced. Like, it's mind-boggling. It's mind-boggling. You're so unlikely that you would be here that it's almost incalculable. So, good for us. Here we are, you know. How successful can you get? So, my point is that part of the way that complexity is dealt with is haphazard. It isn't ever really dealt with. That's why you die. You can only manage it to a limited degree. And for us, that's like 3 kids in 100 years, if you're lucky. And that's our knowledge after 3.5 billion years. So the complexity problem is a rough one. Okay, so that's your body. Now let's look inside your body. Now you might think that, you know, we have this sort of idea that's kind of leftover Cartesian, that there's a you and there's a your body, and the you is in your brain. And so, just out of curiosity, how many of you have the subjective sense that the you is in your head? How many of you would locate you, like, for me, I can locate me somewhere, seems to be about there. I feel like that's where I am. And so, how many of people have like the center of their sense of subjectivity in their head? How many people are like that? Okay. How many people are different than that? Okay, so, oh good, okay, so where do you feel the center of your subjectivity? Where would it be?
That's hard to conceptualize, because like, I have like relations views, so I believe in the soul, and I believe in...
Oh, I was thinking more about how it feels. Fair enough, you know, that's perfectly reasonable. I'm thinking of it more as a subjective experience, though.
Then my brain.
Okay.
For me, the heart.
So you're kind of located here? Yeah. How many people would agree with that? Oh yeah, so quite a few of you, eh? So that's the same for you?
Here, I don't know.
More like here.
Yeah.
Oh, Any other places? Any other places you can talk about? So yeah. Sorry. Any other places?
More outside of my body. I don't know. It's not like...
Oh, that's not good. That's not... No, I'm kidding. Okay. So we kind of got head and heart, and you know that's really kind of historically standard. The Greeks seem to have located themselves sort of in their heart, you know. And there's some theory that as people became more intellectualized, that feeling sort of went up to their head, and maybe before the heart there was the stomach, you know. And you know, you might think that you're your stomach if you were hungry all the time, right? I mean, you're just not ever hungry, so like, why the hell would you think you were your stomach? But, you know, that's another way that culture sort of keeps complexity at bay. You don't even, that's almost like a motivational state that modern people don't even have to contend with, because you're never really hungry. I mean, how many of you have gone without food for more than 24 hours? Oh, that's pretty good. How many of you involuntarily went without food for more than 24 hours? Oh yeah, well, that's rough. Okay, how about a week? Nobody. How about 3 days? Okay, well, so, you know, there's a couple of people who've gone for reasonable periods of time without eating, but fundamentally you can tell we kind of got that problem under control. So you don't have to worry too much about you being your stomach, but I'll tell you, if you were starving at some point, that's probably where you'd locate yourself. Okay, so now you're inside the body, and so let's take a look at how the body works inside. So you kind of feel that you're in your brain, most of you anyways. And you know, you kind of think your brain is in your head, but really that's not right. I don't really understand ever why we kind of decided that our brains were in our head. Because, well, look at it. There's the nervous system. It's like, it's not in your head. It's distributed through your whole body. There's a lot of it up in your head, but there's the whole spinal cord. That's an important thing. And then it has all these branching nerves that allow you to move your hands and to feel things. And it's like your nervous system is distributed all the way through your body. So it's not reasonable to think about the way that you operate as you see things with your brain and then you do things. Now, if that's sort of true, but there's important ways that it's not true at all, and it's important to know the ways that it's not true. It helps you understand phenomena that you couldn't otherwise understand. So I can give you an example. There are people who experience blindness, but it isn't because their eyes get damaged, it's because they have brain damage, and so it damages the visual cortex, and so that's the higher order part of the brain that's responsible for conscious vision. Okay, so maybe they get, I don't know, they get a tumor, or they get hit in the head, or they get shot or something, and then poof, they're blind. And so then they tell you they can't see anything, and then you say to them, okay, well, that's fine, you can't see anything, but let's play a game, okay? I'm going to hold up my left hand or my right hand, and you're going to guess about which I'm holding up. And so you do this, and they go right, and you do this, and they go left, 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 right, right. And they're right. And you tell them, you're right, and they say, well, I can't be, because I don't see anything. So that's blind sight. Okay, so here's another kind of blind sight. So you take the same person, and you set them in front of a screen, and you say, well, look at the screen, and they tell you, I told you already I can't see anything, and then you flash faces at them, and you check for changes in the conductivity of their skin. Because when people react emotionally, they sweat a little more, a little less, and that changes how electricity passes through their skin. And so you show them a smiling face, and there's not much of a change, and you show them a neutral face, and there's not much of a change, and then you show them like a really aggressive or really afraid face, and poof, it spikes. And you do that a number of times, and you show them, well, as soon as I show you a face of someone who's afraid, or a face of someone who's angry, you react to it psychophysiologically. You think, well, how the hell can that happen if they can't see? And the answer to that is, you don't just see with your vision. You see with your body. And so one of the things that you'll find, for example, if you go through Swanson's paper, I'll read you a little bit about this later, is that most of your senses map onto multiple levels of your nervous system. So some of them map right onto your spine. And that's good, because now and then your eyes should tell your spine to do something before you think. Because thinking's too slow. And so, you got to understand, like, way back when we were frogs, roughly speaking, we had eyes. We didn't have much of a brain. So, like, what the hell were the eyes doing? It's not like the frog exactly sees. And you might think, well, how could eyes inform you about the world if you don't exactly see? And then you got to kind of think about it in a Piagetian sense. It's like, here's an example. You might take an animal like a sponge, pretty simple animal, and it can open and close pores on the outside of its surface according to different changes in the ocean that surrounds it. And so its perception is sort of like, the ocean has 3 states, whatever those might be, maybe it has 10, I don't know, but for the sake of simplicity we'll say 3. The ocean manifests itself in 3 pattern states. In pattern state 1, I do this. In pattern state 2, I do this. In pattern state 3, I do this. And so it's direct pattern onto action mapping. And so animals can use their eyes just to react with. They don't have to see the thing. Because you think, you see, and then you act. But why do that? You can just react. And you know this already because, in a simple way, if you put your hand on a hot stove, you'll go like this, and then you'll feel the pain. And what that means is that your body has conserved the relationship between your sensory neurons and your motor neurons at a spinal level. So that your perception of the heat is this. It's not of the heat. It's just mapping a bodily pattern onto a sensory pattern. And so a lot of really primitive sensory input is exactly that. It's just the sense detects a pattern, and with no intermediary of interpretation, that pattern is translated into a behavioral output. And so there's actually generally, the simplest cells are sensory motor cells, so they do both. They map the pattern and they react. And then the sensory and the motor cells differentiate. And then neural tissue grows inside them. And so then what happens is that instead of an outside pattern being mapped immediately onto a behavioral pattern, the neural intermediary says, okay, this pattern could mean any of these 3 things. And then that neural layer grows and grows and grows until, in creatures like us, it's like a whopping layer. And so we see a pattern and we go, that could be this, 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 this. And then all of those things could be mapped onto this or this or this or this or this. So, it makes us more slower, but more flexible. And slow can be a problem. So like when you're walking down a pathway and a snake appears, you don't want to be thinking, snake, rubber hose, stick, whatever, because then you're dead because the snake bites you. What you want to do is catch the snake out of the corner of your eye and jump up into the air before you even know that you saw a snake. And you can do that because your eyes can map right onto your spine. And they don't just map right onto your spine, they map onto your nervous system at all sorts of levels. So for example, with the blind sight person who's looking at the face, so it's an angry face, the eyes are still mapping information onto the amygdala. And so the amygdala changes the psychophysiology. You know, it says prepare for threat. And so the person might feel uneasy. But it's weird, but that's a form of sight. To feel uneasy can be a form of sight. So, and that's to say even more clearly that your brain just isn't in your head. It's like, it's all the way up. It's all the way from, and this is a nice Piagetian viewpoint because, you know, in some sense what Piaget says about children is they sort of organize themselves from the spinal level upwards. You know, they learn these little subroutines. First of all, they have a few subroutines. Those are like built right into the spine. And then they start playing with those and chaining them together in flexible ways, and they keep doing that, you know, in more and more complex ways until they're capable of the abstract representation of thought. And you can see how this will work as we go through the nervous system. So your brain's in your body. In fact, there's some evidence, and there's more than one kind of nervous system too, right? There's the central nervous system that allows you to move voluntarily, and that, you know, provides you with sensory feedback, some of which you're conscious of. There's also the autonomic nervous system that runs all the complex machinery that you're too stupid to attend to. You know, because your consciousness gets little jobs. It doesn't get to run your liver, for example. You imagine what your life would be like if you were in charge of your liver? It's like, you'd have been dead years ago, because what do you know about livers? So you have a whole system, like the autonomic nervous system, which has more neurons than the central nervous system, that just runs all that stuff for you, which is, you know, a good thing, you know, and then you don't have to pay attention to it. So anyways, there's a lot of distribution of neural tissue throughout your body, and there's even some evidence that you have like a second brain of sorts in your solar plexus, where, you know, that's perhaps part of the reason why you really don't like to get hit there. But there's a tremendous number of serotonergic neurons, for example, in your midsection, and there's increasing evidence that those are associated with things like emotion and mood. And so the idea that the brain is here, it's like, no, not really. It's a continuum. You know, your body is a psychophysiological entity, and to separate it into body and mind is like, it's not right. The other thing that seems to be increasingly clear among, say, the robotics guys is you can't even be smart unless you have a body. And so that's why the advanced intelligence guys are building robots from the bottom up. They're doing it just like Piaget would have suggested. It's like, well, build some things that can move, and then chain those things that can move together so that they can move in more complex ways, and then chain them together so they can work in more complex ways. And once you've got this thing that can do things, then stick a brain on it. And then it'll have things it can do with its brain. And if you don't do it that way, you get something that can't function intelligently. It's close to that. So there is the brain. And one way of dividing it into its major subcomponents is represented. There's a variety of ways you can do this. You can divide it into hemispheres because it's sort of split down the middle. The right hemisphere seems to be kind of specialized for the processing of unknown information, and the left seems to be more comfortable working where you know what's going to happen. And the left is most generally the linguistic part of the brain, although not always. It's a rough, you know, what would you call it?
My stream chat.
It's a rough truth. There's lots of exceptions. The linguistic system tends to specialize in the left. And the left sort of insists that it knows what's going on. And the right is always looking out for things that don't fit and sort of convincing the left slowly and sort of under the table to change its viewpoints. And a lot of that seems to happen when you're asleep and you're dreaming. So the right, maybe what's happening when you're dreaming is that during the day your cognitive processes are pretty tight and defined, and they better be, right? Because you don't want to be dreaming your schizophrenic dreams in the daytime. That's a bad idea. So you got to stay kind of focused and narrow in a way during the day. But the problem with that narrow focus is that you're not paying attention to a lot of things. And so it kind of looks like your right hemisphere keeps track of the potentially important things that you're not keeping track of, and then at night your category system sort of broadens and loosens. You can tell that in dreams because they're so weird, and that's maybe when the right hemisphere is sort of tapping some new information into the left and playing with how it might be recategorized without completely overwhelming the left, because you don't want to, just because you learn something new, doesn't mean you want to upset yourself totally, right? So it's a real complex dynamic between stability and learning. And it's conceivable that's why you have two hemispheres. So who knows? It's a good theory though. And the guy who came up with it fundamentally, his name is Goldberg, Elkonin Goldberg. He was a student of Alexander Luria's, who was a great neuropsychologist. So, you know, it's a credible idea. So here's some rough divisions. You've got your cerebellum. That cerebellum, we don't know what the hell that thing does. If you don't have one, you get all wobbly. But there's more neurons in the cerebellum than there are in the rest of the brain. So, like, is it just making you not wobbly? It seems like a tremendous devotion of resources to something that's relatively simple. So, alcohol, when you're a new drinker, alcohol is really hard on the cerebellum, which is why you're, you know, totally useless in a motorway and you fall down and all those things happen. But so that's the cerebellum, and we don't know what it does, even though it's very complexly branched. It kind of looks like a cauliflower, and it's just packed full of neurons. And then there's the occipital lobe, and that you kind of use that to see with, more or less. And then the parietal lobe kind of helps you keep track of who you are from a bodily perspective, and sort of where your body's located in space, and sort of who you are as an embodied person. So, for example, if you lose the right parietal lobe because you have a stroke, then you lose the left side of your body, and even more weirdly, you lose the left side of everything. So all of a sudden you can't see the left side of anything. And no one can figure out what that's like, because say I'm looking at this room, and I have this parietal damage. If I'm looking at the room, do I not see the left side of the room? And then if I look at you, all of a sudden I don't see your left side. Like, we can't figure that out. Like, the left is gone, but then the left is relative to where you happen to be looking. Now, I think one of the ways of understanding it is sort of like, you know how you clearly can't see anything behind your head. And it's not black where you can't see, right? It's black if you close your eyes. But there's a difference between what you can't see behind your head and the black you see when you close your eyes, because the black sort of seems like nothing. But compared to what's behind your head, it's not nothing at all. So I think what happens with people who have neglect, parietal damage, is that like back part just goes like this. And so instead of, you know, you seeing this much of the world and this being just not there at all as far as vision is concerned, it goes like this. And so then you've only got like a quarter of the world that you're, and so people like that, sometimes they'll throw their own legs out of bed. So they wake up and they think, oh my God, because they can kind of detect the left, but not very well. And they're quite freaked out because, you know, like, do you really want to wake up with a leg in bed with you? No, so they grab it and throw it out, and that's not so good because they're attached to it. Or so they'll eat, and they only eat half the food on their plate. But if you turn the plate, then they'll eat half of the half that's left. So anyways, that's the parietal lobe. Temporal lobe. That enables you to hear, roughly speaking. There's a lot of memory there too. And the frontal lobe, well, first of all, the frontal lobe seems to allow you to make voluntary movements, sort of at the highest level of abstraction. And then the prefrontal cortex, which would be right at the front of the yellow there, it's sort of like the back part of the frontal lobe enables you to make voluntary movements. But the prefrontal cortex enables you to represent the potential motor movements that you might make before you implement them. And so it evolved out of the motor strip during the course of evolution. It's sort of like, well, first you learned how to act voluntarily, and then as that grew, and it's particularly big in human beings, that part was able to divorce actions from your body, represent them in an abstract space, run them as simulations, calculate the outcome, and then implement them or not. And you know, it's a hit and miss business, because lots of you people undoubtedly simulate catastrophic outcomes and then go do whatever it is you were going to do anyways. Like, you know, that happens to people all the time, say when they're trying to stop drinking or to stop using cocaine or not to binge eat. Or so, you know, your prefrontal cortex can whip up these simulations, but other parts of your body can override them quite badly. So that's sort of roughly the brain, at least from, you know, looking at it from the side. And then this is it split down the middle. And you can see that it's not precisely two hemispheres all the way down. In the middle, it's one thing, and then it grows these two things like a little hat. And as far as I'm concerned, all the important parts of the brain are low down, central, old. You know, because people like to think that, well, if it evolved a long time ago, it's primitive. It's like, no. If it evolved a long time ago, it's been around a long time. It's really smart. That's why you don't run your liver. The autonomic nervous system runs it because it's been around for an awful long time and it knows exactly how to do it. And so it's really, in some sense, the new parts of the brain in many ways are the parts that are primitive. So, and the old parts are extremely necessary and sophisticated. And so the areas we're going to concentrate on most particularly are, well, the cortex we've already talked about. The cortex is probably responsible. People like to think of it as responsible for consciousness, and there's something about that that's right, but it's quite clear that human beings can remain conscious even if they have a substantial amount of damage to the cerebral cortex. So consciousness is a really weird thing. We're not very good at figuring out where it's localized at all. Cerebral cortex, thalamus. The thalamus is the place where all your sensory information comes together. So, you know, when you look at the world, it's kind of like a continuum of experience despite the fact that you have these 5 different sensory inputs. And the thalamus seems to sort of unite all that, and then it sends the messages that it amalgamates up to the cortex, and the cortex sends them back, and the thalamus sends them back, and there's like this loop between the thalamus and the cortex, and maybe that's part of what consciousness is. You know, rather than being localized in an area, it could easily be a process. And you know, the fact that consciousness sort of turns on in the morning, which is a very weird thing, seems to indicate to me that it's probably something like that. It's a loop. It's the looping interaction between brain areas. And you know, if something's looping like that, it gets really weird properties. So that's a positive feedback system, you know. And I don't know if you've ever hooked a video camera to a TV and then turned the video camera on the TV. You know, it starts doing extremely weird things. You can get all sorts of unbelievably complex designs and weird phenomena because the TV is recycling its own signal, you know. So there's this circuit in there that's looping. And I suspect consciousness is something like that. The hippocampus is responsible for the movement of short-term information into long-term storage. It's a very important part of the brain. We'll talk about that more next time. The amygdala is responsible for a lot of emotional responses. And the hypothalamus is responsible for a lot of primordial motivational states. And so we'll stop, and we'll start with the hypothalamus on Tuesday. See you soon.
me to start reading my book. Have a good day or night. I'm at work, so I'm checking in from time to time. It's mostly her. Most everyone else is temporary or something. I mean, there's other characters. But they might die. It's in that document. She's a tomboy. I also talk about how she acts. She's going to need to run and stuff. So eventually that might be an issue. But if you want to start her off on that, it's fine. Yes, it's fantasy. I gave you a reference in Discord. When I said pants, I meant long pants. Kinda like what female pirates wear. Those are shorts XD. But we can do a dress. I put something in the Discord. She ain't Sarah from Kingdom Hearts XD. Sarah asterisk. Stupid phone. but yet, she's supposed to be cute. But she likes doing classically guyish things like drinking beer, partying at the tavern, and whatnot. Okay. Looking cute. Stretch if you need to. Health first. Sleep if you need XD.